You think you'd recognize stupidity when you see it. Loud, irrational, dangerous, even. But what if it's not what you expect? What if stupidity doesn't look like ignorance, but like obedience? A kind voice, a familiar slogan, a well-meaning person doing what everyone else is doing without ever stopping to think. Picture this: a respected scientist spreading misinformation, a teacher endorsing harmful ideas, a parent making unsafe decisions because it's what the crowd believes is right. These aren't foolish people. They're intelligent, educated. But something vital is missing: the ability to pause, reflect, and say, wait, does this even make sense? In the 1940s, Dietrich Bonhoeffer sat inside a Nazi prison cell and wrote, "Against stupidity, we are defenseless." Because unlike evil, stupidity doesn't feel wrong. It feels righteous. It feels like loyalty. And that's exactly what makes it so dangerous. At MindLens, we often speak of the unconscious, shadow work, and personal transformation. But what happens when the real danger isn't inside one person, but inside the crowd? When intelligence isn't lacking, but has been surrendered collectively? Today, we turn to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a voice of piercing moral clarity, who warned not just about power, but about what happens when thought itself disappears. This video is not about low intelligence. It's about what happens when we choose comfort over clarity, repetition over reflection, obedience over awareness. You're about to hear a theory you were never meant to hear. And once you do, you won't see the world or yourself the same way again. Take a breath. Let's begin. What if the people supporting dangerous ideas aren't ignorant at all? What if they're doctors, scientists, teachers, even spiritual leaders? What if the greatest threat to truth isn't stupidity in the usual sense, but intelligence that has stopped thinking? This is exactly what Dietrich Bonhoeffer witnessed in Nazi Germany. He wasn't surrounded by uneducated masses. He was surrounded by professors, clergy, intellectuals, the very people who once upheld reason and moral clarity. And yet, as the regime rose, he watched them quietly fold. They stopped asking questions. They stopped resisting what didn't feel right. Not because they were incapable of thinking, but because it was easier not to. Bonhoeffer saw it clearly. Stupidity is not a lack of intelligence, but a surrender of moral judgment. It wasn't that these people didn't understand what was happening. It's that they chose not to act on what they knew. They weren't stupid in the traditional sense. They were functionally stupid, intelligent, capable, and even educated, but no longer thinking for themselves. This is what makes functional stupidity so dangerous. It hides behind credentials. It speaks with confidence. It wears the mask of reason, but beneath it is obedience, fear, or blind conformity. And the smarter the person, the more skillfully they can justify their silence. In times of moral crisis, intelligence isn't enough. What matters is the courage to think independently, especially when it's inconvenient, uncomfortable, or unsafe. That's the illusion Bonhoeffer warned us about, that we think education protects us from error, when in fact, without conscience, education can simply make our mistakes more convincing. So next time you hear someone say something shocking, don't just ask, how could they believe that? Ask instead, what part of them stopped thinking? Because that's where it starts, not with stupidity, but with surrender. Before Bonhoeffer became a name quoted in psychology videos and philosophy essays, he was a young German theologian, one who grew up believing that reason, education, and spiritual values could hold a society together. He was born into an intellectual family. His father was a prominent psychiatrist. His siblings were highly educated. Bonhoeffer studied theology, earned his doctorate by the age of 21, and could have easily lived the life of a comfortable academic. But history had other plans. As the Nazi Party began to rise, Bonhoeffer saw something terrifying unfold. It wasn't just hatred marching in uniform. It was silence from the church, compliance from scholars, obedience from ordinary people. He realized the collapse wasn't caused by ignorance, it was caused by educated, well-meaning people surrendering their moral autonomy. These were not mindless mobs. These were pastors quoting scripture, professors citing logic, neighbors who still waved politely, while slowly aligning themselves with something monstrous. Bonhoeffer saw what few dared to name. Society can look civilized on the outside, while intellectually collapsing from within. He began to write, not just theological commentary, but moral warnings, letters, essays, and fragments that cut to the root of human behavior under authoritarian influence. In 1943, imprisoned for his role in a plot to resist Hitler, he wrote his most piercing insight. Against stupidity, we are defenseless. He didn't mean people were dumb. He meant that stupidity as a social force is immune to reason. You can't debate it. You can't appeal to it. You can't shame it into changing. Why? Because the functionally stupid person doesn't feel stupid. They feel certain. They feel loyal. They feel like they're doing the right thing. And that's what scared Bonhoeffer most. Not evil in the traditional sense, but good intentions. Divorced from independent thought, being weaponized by power. This wasn't a theory from the comfort of an ivory tower. It was a warning written from inside a prison cell, a cell he would never leave. Bonhoeffer was executed in April 1945, just weeks before the war ended. But the questions he left behind remain terrifyingly relevant. What happens when people stop thinking, not because they're forced to, but because they've convinced themselves it's righteous not to? And more importantly, can it happen again? It's easy to fear evil. The world has taught us how to spot it. A dictator, a criminal, a violent extremist. But Bonhoeffer's insight was far more disturbing. He believed stupidity was more dangerous than evil. Why? Because evil, at its core, is aware of itself. It knows it's doing harm. It expects resistance. It triggers discomfort. That very tension between wrong and right creates friction. Sometimes even repentance. But stupidity is blind to its own danger. It feels clean, noble, loyal. It doesn't recognize harm because it believes it's helping. That's what makes it unstoppable. Evil always carries within itself the seed of its own destruction. Bonhoeffer wrote, "It creates unease. It provokes resistance, but stupidity, it is immune." You can't argue with someone who has outsourced their thinking. You're not debating a mind. You're confronting a programmed pattern of slogans, tribal cues, and emotional reflexes. Bonhoeffer saw this happen across Germany, not with wild-eyed radicals, but with respectable citizens, repeating words that weren't even theirs. And today, we see the same pattern. People sharing disinformation with pride, chanting slogans they barely understand, blocking out evidence, not because they're evil, but because they feel certain, because they feel safe. This kind of functional stupidity is almost algorithmic. It doesn't ask what's true. It asks, what will keep me accepted? What will protect me from conflict? That's why it spreads so fast. Because it taps into fear, identity, and comfort. The places where thought doesn't like to go. Evil needs effort. But stupidity needs nothing but silence. It thrives in systems where dissent is discouraged. It grows wherever questioning is labeled dangerous. It flourishes when people stop thinking, not because they can't, but because they don't want to pay the price of thinking. That's what Bonhoeffer feared most. A world where being thoughtful becomes a risk, and being thoughtless becomes a virtue. In 1961, an ordinary classroom at Yale University became the setting for one of psychology's most haunting discoveries. Volunteers were told they were helping with a study on learning and memory. Their job seemed simple: read a question and, if the learner got it wrong, administer a shock. Each mistake meant a stronger shock. The voltage climbed. So did the screams. Some participants hesitated. They asked, "Should I keep going?" The man in the lab coat simply said, "The experiment requires you to continue." And they did. Most of them went all the way believing they were inflicting pain on a stranger. Their hands trembled, their voices cracked. Some broke into cold sweat, but they obeyed. Why? Not because they wanted to hurt someone. Not because they lacked empathy, but because they thought someone else was in charge of the thinking. This is the kind of obedience Dietrich Bonhoeffer had warned about 2 decades earlier. Not obedience that screams. Obedience that nods. That signs forms. That follows protocol. Obedience that hides behind, "I was just doing my job." He saw how ordinary people, decent, even kind, could become instruments of destruction simply by refusing to think independently. It never starts with cruelty. It starts with comfort. With people saying, "Everyone else is doing it. It's not my place to question. I'm sure someone else knows better." The most dangerous kind of submission isn't forced. It's chosen when questioning becomes inconvenient, and conformity feels safer than conscience. In today's world, obedience looks different. It's not uniforms and salutes. It's clicking "I agree" without reading, forwarding information without verifying, staying silent in the face of harm because it's not your fight. We obey algorithms. We obey groupthink. We obey what's familiar, even if it contradicts what's right. Bonhoeffer understood this. Tyranny doesn't need monsters. It only needs enough people willing to stop thinking for themselves. Bonhoeffer never used the term functional stupidity, but what he described is now known by that name. It's not the stupidity of not knowing. It's the kind that arises when people choose not to know, when the systems around them reward silence, speed, and simplicity, and punish reflection, slowness, and complexity. Think about your daily life. You're overloaded with information, scrolling through hundreds of headlines, posts, emails. Every platform wants your attention fast. Your brain, already exhausted, starts filtering automatically, not based on truth, but based on what's easiest to accept. We live in a world that doesn't just tolerate thoughtlessness, it incentivizes it. News headlines are designed to spark outrage. Social media feeds reward quick reactions. Productivity culture praises multitasking over depth. And algorithms? They learn what makes us click, then feed us more of it, regardless of whether it's true. Bonhoeffer wrote during a time of war, but the mechanism he described has only evolved. Back then, propaganda was delivered through newspapers and radios. Now, it's curated by AI, delivered in micronds, tailored not to your values, but to your impulses. This new form of stupidity isn't loud. It doesn't burn books. It buries them under distractions. Under an endless scroll. Under the illusion that you've seen enough to know what's going on. And so people stop researching. They stop asking hard questions. They stop slowing down to think, because thinking costs energy they no longer have. But here's the danger. When enough people stop thinking, it doesn't just affect individuals, it reshapes the whole culture. In Bonhoeffer's time, the cost of thinking was prison. Today, it might just be social discomfort, isolation, or missing out. But the temptation is the same. Let someone else decide what's true. Let someone else take the risk of being wrong. Just follow along. And when that becomes a habit, stupidity becomes the default. Not because we're not smart enough, but because we've structured our world to make independent thought inconvenient. Bonhoeffer never used the term functional stupidity, but what he described is now known by that name. It's not the stupidity of not knowing. It's the kind that arises when people choose not to know, when the systems around them reward silence, speed, and simplicity, and punish reflection, slowness, and complexity. Think about your daily life. You're overloaded with information, scrolling through hundreds of headlines, posts, emails. Every platform wants your attention fast. Your brain, already exhausted, starts filtering automatically, not based on truth, but based on what's easiest to accept. We live in a world that doesn't just tolerate thoughtlessness, it incentivizes it. News headlines are designed to spark outrage. Social media feeds reward quick reactions. Productivity culture praises multitasking over depth. And algorithms? They learn what makes us click, then feed us more of it, regardless of whether it's true. Bonhoeffer wrote during a time of war, but the mechanism he described has only evolved. Back then, propaganda was delivered through newspapers and radios. Now, it's curated by AI, delivered in microseconds, tailored not to your values, but to your impulses. This new form of stupidity isn't loud. It doesn't burn books. It buries them under distractions. Under an endless scroll. Under the illusion that you've seen enough to know what's going on. And so people stop researching. They stop asking hard questions. They stop slowing down to think, because thinking costs energy they no longer have. But here's the danger. When enough people stop thinking, it doesn't just affect individuals, it reshapes the whole culture. In Bonhoeffer's time, the cost of thinking was prison. Today, it might just be social discomfort, isolation, or missing out. But the temptation is the same. Let someone else decide what's true. Let someone else take the risk of being wrong. Just follow along. And when that becomes a habit, stupidity becomes the default. Not because we're not smart enough, but because we've structured our world to make independent thought inconvenient. Back in the 1950s, psychologist Solomon Asch conducted a simple but powerful experiment. He gathered groups of people and showed them a series of lines. One line was clearly longer than the others. The task? Just say which line matched in length. But there was a twist. All but one person in the group were actors, and they'd been instructed to give the wrong answer. What happened? 3 out of 4 people went along with the group at least once, even when the answer was obviously wrong. They didn't argue. They didn't question. They just conformed. Not because they were blind, but because they didn't want to be the only one who saw differently. This is what Bonhoeffer understood long before social psychology gave it a name. He wasn't just observing evil acts. He was watching rational, educated people silence their own minds to fit in. And nothing destroys independent thought faster than the pressure to belong. It starts early. In school, don't raise your hand too much. At work, don't challenge the meeting. Online, don't question your side, just amplify it. Soon, truth isn't something we discover. It's something we inherit from whatever group we fear losing. Stop asking, is this right? And start wondering, will they still accept me if I disagree? And that's the moment critical thinking dies, not with a bang, but with a nod. Functional stupidity doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just smiles and says, I'll go with the flow. It's more comfortable to echo than to resist. Easier to blend in than to break ranks. And safer, so much safer, to pretend you don't notice when something feels off. But comfort has a price, and that price is clarity. In every culture, every century, there comes a point where people stop thinking for themselves, not because they're forced, but because the fear of being other feels worse than the fear of being wrong. That's how groupthink works. It replaces reason with rhythm, insight with imitation, and truth with consensus. It's easy to assume that people reject truth because they're misinformed. But often, it's something much deeper. Truth makes them uncomfortable. Real truth is rarely convenient. It forces you to change your mind, re-examine your values, or admit that something you once defended might have been wrong. And for many people, that's not just painful, it's destabilizing. So instead, they reach for what's familiar, what feels good, What confirms what they already believe? It's not that they can't handle the truth. It's that they've never been taught how to sit with discomfort. We're wired to avoid pain, mental pain included. So when we come across ideas that challenge us, our first instinct isn't curiosity. It's defense. We tune out, we scroll past, we unfollow. We find a video that makes us feel smart, rather than one that makes us feel wrong. This is where ignorance becomes a strategy. Not a lack of exposure, but a choice to stay within the emotional safe zone. And in a world designed to soothe rather than awaken, that choice gets easier every day. Bonhoeffer saw this long before the age of the algorithm. He watched as truth was replaced by loyalty, as people embraced simple answers, not because they were right, but because they were easy to remember, easy to repeat, and easy to live with. The danger wasn't that they lacked knowledge. It's that they lacked the will to face what knowing would cost them. Because to truly confront reality, to look at injustice, corruption, manipulation, and say, this is wrong, and I can't ignore it, takes more than intellect. It takes courage, it takes loss, sometimes even loneliness. And let's be honest, comfort is easier. So people stay where they are. Not because it's true, but because truth has a price, and ignorance feels free. Let's be honest, thinking clearly takes energy. Questioning everything you hear, weighing evidence, challenging assumptions, it's mentally expensive. But what happens when your life is already overloaded? When you're working 2 jobs, caring for family, juggling bills, and trying to stay afloat in a world that never slows down? You don't have the luxury of philosophical inquiry. You just want to get through the day. This is what economists call rational ignorance. When the cost of understanding something outweighs the benefit, we let it go. We don't dig deeper. We scroll past. We say, someone else will figure it out. And just like that, ignorance becomes efficient. Bonhoeffer didn't use modern economic terms, but he understood this pressure intimately. He saw how political systems could create the conditions where independent thought becomes not just risky, but impractical. And today, those pressures are no longer tied only to authoritarian regimes. They're built into daily life. Fast-paced. Jobs that reward performance, not reflection. Rent that consumes half your income. Health insurance that hangs by a thread. News cycles designed to exhaust you into numbness. It's not that people choose to stop thinking. It's that the system quietly convinces them, you don't have time for this. Just accept it. Keep moving. And when the body is stressed, the brain follows. Studies show that mental bandwidth shrinks under financial strain. When we're in survival mode, we don't prioritize long-term reasoning. We look for certainty, shortcuts, emotional signals, and in that moment truth doesn't disappear. It just becomes inconvenient. So what happens when entire societies live like this? When people are too exhausted to research, too overwhelmed to question, too distracted to notice the slow erosion of their own minds. You don't need censorship. You don't need fear. You just need people who are too tired to think. And that's what Bonhoeffer feared most. Not just forced obedience, but voluntary numbness born from a life that doesn't leave room to care. Even if you had the time, even if you had the energy, there's still one more problem. Your brain isn't naturally wired for truth. It's wired for speed, for pattern recognition, for familiarity, for making just enough sense to stay safe. Thousands of years ago, this was essential. When you heard rustling in the bushes, you didn't stop to weigh the probabilities. You ran, because the brain evolved to prioritize survival over precision. But today, that same instinct that once protected us now leads us into mental shortcuts that distort reality. This is what psychologists call cognitive bias. We're drawn to what confirms our beliefs. We dismiss what contradicts them. We remember emotionally charged moments more vividly than facts. And we mistake repetition for truth. Have you ever had the feeling something must be true simply because you've heard it so many times? That's not awareness, that's familiarity bias. And the brain loves it. Bonhoeffer didn't have MRI machines or neuroscience research. But he saw it firsthand. People repeating slogans, not because they understood them, but because those words felt safe, felt right, felt like belonging. When our brains are under stress, financial, emotional, social, we don't seek out complexity. We cling to simplicity, to whatever narrative fits our current identity. This is why propaganda doesn't have to be clever. It just has to be repetitive enough to feel familiar and emotional enough to feel true. So even if you're intelligent, educated, curious, your mind is still vulnerable. It's not your fault. It's biology. But here's the uncomfortable truth. What protected our ancestors from lions now leaves us exposed to manipulation, repetition, and illusion. Because in a world where information is weaponized, thinking clearly isn't natural anymore. It's a conscious act of resistance. You used to know when you were being influenced. A speech, a billboard, a headline. It felt external, something coming at you. But today, the most powerful form of manipulation doesn't come from the outside. It arrives dressed as your own thought. You scroll. You see a post that feels true. You don't remember where you first heard the idea, but it feels familiar. It feels yours. So you like it, share it, build on it. You forget to ask, did I choose this belief? Or did it choose me? That's how modern systems work. They don't argue with you. They don't coerce. They observe. They watch what makes you pause, what you click, what you fear. And then they don't tell you what to think. They simply flood you with the same flavor of thought, until it becomes the only taste you trust. This is not the propaganda of the past. This is internalized persuasion, tailored, invisible, self-reinforcing. You think you're informed, but in reality, you're being emotionally profiled and looped. Bonhoeffer saw a world where people parroted slogans, but what he couldn't foresee was a world where the slogans are customized, made to feel like insights you came up with yourself. No force, no flags, just a perfectly curated environment where every headline, every suggestion, every outrage nudges your thinking a little further from reflection and a little closer to reaction. In this world, there's no need to ban books. You just bury them under infinite content, under endless novelty, under the illusion that scrolling equals awareness. You're not being silenced. You're being distracted. You're not being lied to. You're being drowned in what you already want to hear. By the time you realize it, your worldview isn't something you built. It's something that's been softly assembled, one click, one dopamine hit, one confirmation at a time. And that's the real danger. When the voice in your head still sounds like you, but it's been trained by someone else's code. Bonhoeffer had a choice. He could have stayed quiet, continued teaching, writing, kept his head down and waited for the storm to pass, but he didn't, because he understood something that many never do. Truth, when it matters most, always comes with a cost. He called it costly grace. The courage to remain conscious when unconsciousness feels easier. To resist when going along would make life so much simpler. To think for yourself knowing it might cost you reputation, safety, even your life. Bonhoeffer didn't theorize about this. He lived it. He spoke out against the Nazi regime while others rationalized their silence. He joined a resistance movement while others turned away. He was arrested, imprisoned, and eventually executed, not for violence, but for refusing to surrender his mind to something he knew was wrong. That's the price of intellectual integrity. It rarely looks heroic in the moment. It often looks like discomfort, isolation, doubt. But Bonhoeffer saw through the illusion of passive goodness. He knew that silence, too, is a position. That neutrality, too, is a choice. In a world that rewards compliance, The decision to think clearly becomes an act of spiritual rebellion. To read slowly. To question the obvious. To say, I don't know, instead of repeating what everyone else says they do. To pause long enough to ask, is this true or just easy? Bonhoeffer died with dignity. But his message was never just about death. It was about what it means to stay awake when sleep would be safer. And that message? It still asks something of us. Because every time you trade awareness for comfort, a part of your humanity gets quieter, and the cost of staying conscious is nothing compared to the cost of letting that happen. It's easy to point at others and see where they've stopped thinking. Much harder is turning inward. What belief do you hold so tightly that the mere thought of questioning it feels like betrayal? Maybe it's a story about who you are, or who someone else was. Maybe it's a belief that kept you safe once, but now quietly limits you. We all have them, and the deeper the belief, the more invisible it becomes. Bonhoeffer didn't just confront external obedience. He challenged internal certainty. He knew that societies fall asleep collectively, but waking up is always personal. And personal awakening? It starts with a single act of courage. Asking, what if I'm wrong? Not because you want to be wrong, but because you want to be real. Try this. Pick one belief you're absolutely sure of. Something you've defended, shared, built part of your identity around. Then spend just 20 minutes seeking out the best argument against it. Not from trolls or extremists, but from thoughtful, honest minds who see it differently. Not to abandon your belief, but to test its foundations, to see if it stands. Without emotion holding it up. Because truth isn't afraid of pressure, but certainty without examination. That's where functional stupidity hides best, behind good intentions and untouchable assumptions. When we stop challenging our beliefs, we don't become more grounded, we become more fragile. So ask yourself, what idea do I hold that I've never truly challenged? And more importantly, who might I become if I had the courage to do so? We've talked a lot about individuals, about fear, exhaustion, and the quiet surrender of thought. But what happens when the system itself encourages that surrender? When media platforms are optimized for outrage, schools reward memorization, over-inquiry, and politics thrives on simplicity, slogans, and sides? At some point, we have to ask, is this just a personal failure, or are we caught inside a structure that makes thinking harder by design? Bonhoeffer understood this intuitively. He saw that moral collapse doesn't start with monsters, but with systems that reward comfort over conscience. And the truth is, you can't build a thoughtful society on a foundation that punishes reflection and glorifies speed, certainty, and emotional reactivity. So what do? We don't just resist with thought. We restructure with intention. We build education systems that teach how to question, not just what to memorize. We design digital spaces that slow people down, that reward nuance, not noise. We support journalism that values accuracy over virality, and yes, this requires investment, patience, sacrifice, but the alternative is what we already see around us. A culture where the loudest voice wins, where engagement replaces understanding, where I feel it's true becomes more powerful than I can prove it. Bonhoeffer once wrote that stupidity doesn't yield to protest or force, but that doesn't mean we're helpless, because systems are not immovable. They're built, which means they can be rebuilt, but only if enough people choose to stay awake long enough to realize they're inside a structure that needs to be redesigned, not for speed, not for profit, but for clarity, for conscience, for thought. It's tempting to believe that stupidity lives out there, in other people, other groups, other times in history. But Bonhoeffer's final warning wasn't for them. It was for us. Because the moment you think, I could never fall for something so irrational, you already have. Why? Because functional stupidity doesn't announce itself. It feels like certainty. It feels like being right. You might be highly educated. You might be deeply moral. But when fear sets in, when comfort is threatened, when the group speaks louder than your instincts, you may find yourself surrendering your mind without even realizing it, just like they did. That's the part no one wants to hear. Stupidity isn't a matter of IQ, it's a matter of neglect. A mind left unguarded, especially under pressure, becomes the perfect target. And in a world like ours, where outrage spreads faster than facts, where AI tailors your reality, and where speaking up can cost you everything, vigilance becomes an act of resistance. So ask yourself, when was the last time you changed your mind, not because you were pressured, but because the evidence demanded it? When was the last time you said, "I don't know," and let it open a door instead of shutting one? Bonhoeffer didn't die because he was a genius. He died because he refused to stop thinking, even when it would have been easier, safer, more comfortable not to. His legacy isn't just his words. It's the example of a mind that refused to go to sleep. And if we want to honor that, it starts with this. Never assume you're immune. Always question certainty. And when everyone else has stopped thinking, you think harder. Because the future won't be shaped by the loudest voices, but by the quiet ones who chose curiosity over conformity. We live in an age where thinking has become inconvenient, where algorithms tell us what to feel, where certainty is a currency, and where the real danger is no longer ignorance, but the illusion of knowing. Bonhoeffer's greatest gift wasn't a theory, it was a mirror. He didn't just warn us about stupidity. He showed us what it looks like when thinking becomes an act of rebellion, and silence becomes complicity. So the next time you feel the urge to scroll past, to nod along, to say nothing when your gut says otherwise, pause. Ask, is this my thought? Or one I've inherited unquestioned, untested? That single moment of friction might be your most radical act, because when minds go to sleep, history doesn't just repeat. It escalates. In today, with AI, with curated truths, with comfort on sale, we need awakened minds more than ever. If this video made you pause, made you question something you were certain about, don't let that moment slip away. Comment below, I choose to think. Let's make it visible. Let's make it loud. Let's remind the world that in a time where surrender is easy, choosing to think is revolutionary. This is MindLens. And you're not alone. Subscribe for more content that doesn't just inform, it awakens.